Today's video, I want to talk about Evergrande crisis in China, property development company, 300 plus billion in debt. There's been some updates. Some give me heartburn, others are positive, but this could have ramifications in the United States. So let's do a follow-up video and talk about it. Let's get into it. Is China's property bubble signaling a crisis? I did a talk on this a while back, the Evergrande situation, and it's come to the front again. Some concerns. The financial woes of the giant real estate developer Evergrande, which carries an estimated debt, ladies and gentlemen, over 300 billion, roughly around 308, 310 billion, have rekindled global fears that China's property bubble is about to burst. China's real estate problems are roughly threefold. The massive size of the sector, its excessive leverage, and the amount of developer debt in the hands of average households and retail investors is a little nerve-wracking. So new info has come out. They couldn't bury it. So the current property market turmoil originates in regulatory action to reduce financial leverage, and it may not lead to a full-fledged financial meltdown. Such predictions have occurred repeatedly in the past, in particular since 2010, and have been fueled by the rapid rise of property prices, construction volumes, and real estate debt. When you look in the history of this, their rapid rise is incredible, and where they put their investments. So today, many of the analysts fear that if the property bubble collapses, the impact on the real estate economy will be devastating. Some expect China's growth potential to decrease dramatically to 4% per year. And if you put that in perspective, that's from roughly about 8% during 2010 through all of 2019, so could go even lower. So, yet the current property market turmoil originates in regulatory action to reduce financial leverage, and it may not lead to a full-fledged financial meltdown if authorities keep the situation under control. Can you say bailout maybe? What the implications of that would be over here. So most important, reducing the share of construction and real estate activity may slow real gross domestic product (GDP) growth in the short run, but would benefit China's transition to a more productive and sustainable growth model for the future. So some of this, this red hot smoking housing market, in the late 1990s, if you go look at the history of this, in the late 1990s, China's property market witnessed a sustained expansion with only minor corrections lasting no more than a few months. They had it really good. A few little bumps in the road. So the government supported the property sector to strengthen the urban middle class and underpin growth. So banks started issuing home loans in 1997, and credit was easily accessible to both developers and households. Housing became the preferred investment vehicle for the Chinese. You look at, as bank deposit rates were kept artificially low, the stock market suffered severe crash in 2007, as we all remember. Chinese were down on that. They were looking for an asset class, and 2015 a crash, and capital control prevented investment diversification abroad. So kind of all came together for housing looked good. And when you talk about homeownership rate compared to the West, it's incredible. Today the homeownership rate exceeds 90%, 90% compared to 65% in the U.S. and about 70% of household wealth, far higher than in Western economies, is held in real estate in China. So they went all in. And after the global financial crisis, the government used the property sector to spur growth via recurrent waves of easy credit. As a result, residential property prices have more than doubled during the last 15 years alone. I mean, take a look at this graph of that. It's just incredible. So the real estate bubble was fueled by a vast increase in both mortgage and developer debt. Take on that debt. So during the last decade, household mortgage loans increased almost six times to about 6 trillion, while real estate developers' debt almost doubled to 3.5 trillion. You take a look at this graph, 3.5 trillion. So could be some problems. So real estate debt exceeded 50% of GDP at the end of 2021 and contributed to a rapid buildup in Chinese total debt in the economy, which in 2020 almost doubled to around 290% of GDP. And that's after only 2 decades. So housing mortgage loans and developer debt, man, it's out of control. The scale of the building boom unleashed by China's growth stimuli is impressive, very impressive to say the least. The Financial Times reports that in only 2 years, this is incredible, only 2 years from 2011 through all of 2012, China produced more cement than the entire U.S. did in the entire 20th century. Pretty incredible. So during the last 15 years, the volume of floor space under construction by real estate developers increased more than 5 times. Take a look at this graph. So today, when we talk about China's real estate activity, including construction, which accounts for about 30% of GDP annually, compared to 15 to 20% in most developed nations. In addition, local governments depend on land sales for about a third of their fiscal revenues. So, the fact that about roughly a fifth of China's housing units are now vacant certainly points to housing oversupply. There's some videos on this, and it's pretty incredible. And, the amount of oversupply and real estate malinvestment in China. So new housing starts, housing under construction, and land purchases by developers drop significantly. So I talked about this, but kind of top line, what triggered, Evergrande's problems to begin with. The stock market crash, if we go back to 2015, which also had a ripple effect in the financial and real estate sectors. That prompted government action to reduce leverage and risk in the property market. In December 2016, President Xi Jinping said that homes were for living in, not for speculating. What about me, man? Come on. So Xi Jinping introduced the tighter mortgage conditions and restrictions on ownership of multiple homes in order to curtail housing credit, booming residential prices, and overbuilding. So in 2019, going forward, the Communist Party declared that property was not a tool for short-term economic stimulus, and China avoided another oversized growth stimulus during the pandemic. So trying to get rid of those speculators to stop the debt. So last year, the government tackled high leverage in the real estate sector even more forcefully. Regulators capped the share of housing loans that banks may hold, and also imposed, 3 red lines. We've heard those red lines before in the West on large property developers, limiting the size of their debt relative to their assets and equity and cash. This, complemented existing policies to cap growth in, shadow financing that goes on in offshore bond insurers. So mortgage rates were pushed up and land auction rules were tightened, together with hundreds of other regulations covering the property market. So in addition China announced a 5-year program to test a new property tax, which weighed down housing demand and prices further. So we look at the the squeeze on new financing constrained developers, to reduce new investment and cut prices to promote sales. Developers' liquidity, dwindled dramatically, and then falling construction starts, unfinished projects, and lower sales. So big time signs of financial stress emerged rapidly when all that comes together. And not only Evergrande, but also other large developers that you're not hearing about are having issues. Similar players in the market space, not as big as Evergrande, have been defaulting on their debt obligations, folks. And you're not hearing about that. So demand for housing has taken a hit right now, with investors waiting for prices to fall further, to buy, possibly, distressed projects from developers. So at the same time, property-related, non-performing loans went up, reducing the bank's appetite for housing-related lending, and basically exacerbating the financing shortage. So, right now with all that together, doesn't look good. It looks like the perfect storm, with the initial financing squeeze disrupting construction and the real economy, which in turn has aggravated financial stress even further, folks. According to a report by the credit rating agency S&P, about a third of real estate developers could experience, this is very conservative, financial distress and head towards full bankruptcy. When I looked at this, I think it's higher than that. But before, concluding that China's property bubble may finally collapse, one should bear in mind that the current turmoil was triggered by government action, part of a longer-term plan to cool, they purposely wanted to cool the real estate sector. So when you look at this, could China stop property-related financial meltdown? We know what government intervention has done in the West here. So it is possible that government's measures may come too late, and may unintentionally lead to a collapse of the bubble. Yet the authorities still have a few aces up their sleeves, it looks like, from listening to some of the thought leaders on this. The central bank has already started, marginally easing monetary policy and interest rates, encouraging banks to lend more. If necessary, it could also, relax limits on bank lending to developers, which might be a good idea, and household mortgages. So if push comes to shove, regulators could also relax the restrictions on financing developers by extending the deadline for meeting the 3 red lines that they imposed. So if we look at this, despite being cash strapped themselves, some local authorities have stepped in already to finance the completion of Evergrande's projects and make payments to its contractors. So some people are picking up the tab. If we look at the most, extreme scenario, that forced, deleveraging of developers spirals out of control, bringing about a massive correction in prices and activity. China can still do what other countries have also done to delay the inevitable outcome of the the mess of a collapsed property bubble. They could transfer the non-performing real estate debt from the balance sheets of the banks to a special asset management, kind of like a CDO, collateralized debt obligation, asset management company called an AMC, at a discounted value, and then recapitalize the banks. Such operations do not require great fiscal strain, thanks to the magic of modern banking. Just put in the numbers. Where the required equity capital represents only a small fraction of the total bank assets, about 6% in Europe, and thanks to government guarantees of the debt issued by AMCs. So, for example, at a debt of 360% of GDP, the real estate loans in excess of 40% of GDP. Spain's debt, metrics were, marginally worse when its property bubble burst in 2009 than China's are today. So eventually the fiscal cost to transfer banks' bad asset mortgages and developer loans to the AMC, called SARB or SAREB, and recapitalize them, was a manageable 5 to 10% of the GDP. So having public debt of about 45% of GDP in 2021, 95% of GDP, including off-budget obligations, according to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. China could, for now, afford a similar fiscal effort. China also holds vast foreign exchange reserves of about 3.4 trillion. That's 25% of its GDP. And as of the end of 2020, enjoys a much higher savings rate than Spain. So China can always buy time by pushing for business consolidation in the real estate sector, and ask some of its large state-owned enterprises to acquire bad assets from troubled developers. Because, folks, when you look between the lines, these developers are troubled. So they can buy the troubled developers, spreading the cost of the potential crisis out. This appears to be happening already. You bet your ass it is. In Evergrande's restructuring process since its debt default in December, they are getting a little crazy right now. So what about the real estate impact on the growth? The sharp drop in construction and real estate activity has already reduced annual, real GDP growth in China to 4.9% in Q3 and Q4. In Q4 2021, the slowest rate in 18 months. It is obvious that the cooling the property sector cannot be done without lowering growth rates temporarily, while factors of production are, they're going to have to be reallocated to more productive uses. So this is unavoidable. This is unavoidable immediate costs that China has to pay in order to stop overinvestment and the waste of resources in real estate. So after property, bubbles collapse, economic growth can, resume relatively quickly and on a sounder footing right now, because they're not on that, as in the cases of, like I said earlier, if you look at Spain, and if you look at the history of Ireland, that shows. So if downsizes in the bloated property sector, China would have much more resources available to invest in research and development, information and communications technology, artificial intelligence, which they absolutely love, and other high-tech sectors in which it wants to become a global leader. China wants to take over. They want to take over the world, unlike Russia. So the short-term negative economic consequences of deleveraging the real estate market should not stop China from moving ahead. They got some options, but the Chinese government may contain the financial implications, but it cannot offset the real estate sector's impact on the real, and I emphasize this, on the real economy. This means weaker growth for them, higher risk, and lower consumption and investor appetite for China exposure. So kind of looking, we go back to the all-infamous Federal Reserve, but the central banks, the central bank cannot solve a problem of solvency with liquidity. And I talked about this, but what is a recession? Bottom line, property bubble-driven growth always leads to debt-driven stagnation. That's it right there. Stagflation. And that's what we're going to see here in the United States. Hyperinflation, stagflation, as this madness continues with the oil crisis. And one point about this, we talk about over here too, transitioning. We are looking to buy oil from Venezuela, who has the dirtiest oil in the world. So does Russia and China. We have the strictest policies when we talk about refineries and refining the oil. Ours is the best in the world. So we are choosing to not drill, baby, drill in the United States that has more resources. If anywhere in the world, we have enough resources for 200 years, and I guarantee you in 200 years, 100 years, if we're still here, we're going to have some technology where we don't need fossil fuels, but right now we do need them. But we have the strictest policies, and we have the cleanest oil of any country in the world, but we're choosing to buy our oil from Russia, Saudi Arabia, whatever, now Venezuela, a dictatorship socialist country that has the dirtiest oil. Does that make sense? So we're all green, we're all energy, we're all climate change, but we're buying oil right now because we don't want to do anything here, and it's more dirty oil than our oil. Does that make any sense? So we have some serious issues that could have ramifications and carry over to the real estate market in the United States. Yes, people have more equity this time around than they did in 2008. However, people have been pulling cash out of their properties for the last year and a half, living on that cash, and I can pull reports and look at foreclosures and defaults throughout the country, and they are up. So we need to keep an eye on that. But the main point is what happens in China in real estate with this Evergrande and what's going on with their development could have ramifications in the United States if they don't get this under control. Take care.